I'm Mike Waken. I was a PhD student here with Rich. I didn't prepare any introductory remarks because I figured Rich had some kind of prank up his sleeve, as he normally does. When I was TA for his class one year, he announced to the whole class that it was my birthday and had everybody sing happy birthday to me. But of course, it wasn't my birthday. That's how 6 years went. So since Sidney Burrus is the only person to have been here for the last 50 years, we thought it would be a good idea to kind of step back through the waves of progress that have reverberated over the last decades, starting with the 1960s, to have people who were here in that decade talk about what was going on in the Rice DSP group at that time. Rich has kind of selected representatives through the lottery system that he described earlier. So we'll have some people speaking, but also we'd like to invite everybody from that respective decade to come on up during that presentation. You can stand here, and any faculty who joined Rice during that decade, you can stand here as well. And Rich has allotted 7 minutes, but given no other real instructions to each group. And Rich will be the timekeeper, so we'll see how this all goes. And we'll start with the 1960s, and if there's anyone who's not already up here from the 1960s, we invite you to come on up. And we'll have each group self-introduce. Thank you.
The first group is the exception. Best I can tell, we did no research. On the other hand, we set a certain foundation that we should now think about and whether it was a foundation that was worth sustaining. The four of us you see here all showed up at Rice in 1965. By the way, I'll point out the first year to charge tuition, not that I'm still bitter, but it is true. It also happened, Rice at the time was transitioning from a 4+1 program, which was a Bachelor of Art to a Bachelor of Science, to a 5th-year degree called a Master of Electrical Engineering that we still don't know quite was, but we were all for it because there was a war on, and with that extra year, we could not go for a year. So that put all of us in a wonderful position, which was in September of 1969, the four of us, out of the giant graduating class of 23 ECE folks in 1970. Out of that 23, 4 of us took an experimental class taught by a young professor named Sidney Burrus and another one named Tom Parks, who you've heard plenty about already. I can't speak for the other 3. I knew exactly 0 about digital signal processing. I did know something about filters, but not much about DSP, and I will be quite honest to say I was attracted to the class because I had sworn over the last year or 2 to take any course that Sid Burrus taught, no matter what it was. I took a course called 501 or 502 that was on analog synthesis. That didn't turn out so well. So I was so I was hoping this would turn out better. So anyway, what we've done is the 4 of us have arranged to give you a little bit of idea of what was going on at Rice in that last half of the 60s. And my colleagues, Larry Marple and Robert Meyer and Robert Flatt, each have a little piece of this.
So in the beginning. So we're going to take you through our 5 years. When we get to the 5th year, that's the next slide. That was the true beginning, 69, what became the foundation for the DSP program. We, in retrospect, feel really lucky that our coursework at the time prepared us for the advent of the DSP program. The first PhD student, Bob, entered into it, and from 69 on, that's when the program really grew. So a little bit of what's going on, and I did find some old pictures. So here's Sid in the Campanile from, looks like some of the bottom has been taken off anyway, the 66 Campanile. You can tell by his wrist rocks there. It's like the black leather ones. But anyway, what happened in 65? Major events. We've all heard about the FFT. That was sort of the advent of a key DSP paper. That came out in 65. What else came out in 65 was the first paper from Moore that became Moore's law. And back then it was stated that the number of transistors and resistors doubles every year. That was later modified to roughly 2 years, but it's held true all the time. That statement right there, as it became true, certainly was the indicator of what DSP was going to become. So we had techniques, we had hardware in terms of the first integrated circuits in '64 became commercially available. Imagine tens of transistors on one device. That was pretty amazing since we had been designing with single transistors. So it was the techniques, the hardware, going to get into the software, and then the faculty. That clearly was the most important. It set the enthusiasm, the inspiration, and the mentoring that endowed us all, this class and future classes, to set us on the pace. I might put another honorable mention for me who went in statistical signal processing. That Paul Pfeiffer's book was published in '65 and was a big foundational E-centric viewpoint of probability theory that was very helpful in my later career. So all this happened in '65. I would point out most of us were born in '47. That was the year the transistor was invented, and another famous fast algorithm, the Levinson recursion. So FFT for periodicity exploitation, Levinson for invariance across time shifts. So fast algorithms have been at least a big part of my career too. So all this aligned the stars. We were endowed that this was going to happen to us. In our sophomore years, probably the most significant thing was the software story. And we worked on the IBM 1620. That was a single transistor. I think it was 4 flip-flops per board. And we did software that was the forerunner. Things were known as sample data system in those days. Hadn't become digital quite yet. And we looked at approximations that you could do on a computer to solutions for analog systems using discrete time approximations. There we learned about the importance of sampling interval in terms of how close you could get an approximation to an analog solution. Now, we worked on this computer. There was never a blue screen of death. There was no monitor. There was no interaction in those days. When you saw a program went kablooey, and it usually was a light sequence on the panel that told you that, we'd have to reboot. What did rebooting consist of? Well, you see a row of 16 rocker switches. You had to hand enter about the first 30 or 40 instructions, which should tell the card reader to read a deck of cards and insert it in memory. And that was a frequent occurrence because we were always writing fortunate arrays that overwrote the program. And wonderful things. We were using a 1890s technology called holorith cards to punch code in. And that became, we learned about the importance of chads messing up our program way before a certain Florida presidential election. So moving to our junior year, this is the first year Tom Parks came on. This is from the '68 Campanile. We were still in the analog world partly in the 401 class that Sid taught, which was known as linear systems in those days. Today it would be called systems and signals, or signals and systems. There was no digital. We were all Laplace transform based, and the computers we used were analog computers. Now, an analog computer consists of a bank of operational amplifiers, or op-amps, which you could configure into integrators, differentiators, amplifiers. You use plug cords to program it, and at the very top, you see some potentiometers, or pots as we call them, to set resistance. Those were all scaled to whatever the analog problem you were doing to get the right gains and proportions to everything. And that's the way we solved it. Now, it was kind of real time before digital could do it. And beware of the ohm sign there. Kind of a hot topic area, not just necessarily at Rice, but around the nation, is this idea of using digital logic, which only has 2 levels, to come up with a transform base based on something that was 2 levels. That was the thinking that would create something you could implement quickly and on digital systems. The bit level would indicate the scaling. So anyway, that was kind of the thought process, the hot area at that time. And then we move into our senior year. Probably the primary course area, we were starting to get in more to the digital logic using the integrated circuits. So Joe Cypress taught that. That was our first connection to TI for a long time, before Sid got with his classmate there at Texas Instruments. So we've had a long association at Rice with Texas Instruments. The key project there, what I want to mention, was something called the Klooge. Every digital circuits course had a class project. This was an ongoing class project from class to class to class. Each class built a portion of the logic that would do the calculator functions. And it became a klooge of how it came together between each class. I would point out 68 was also an important year for 2 master's theses. So not only was our class kind of getting on the ground floor with software, hardware, theory, and the faculty, the first sort of what I would call deep DSP studies getting introduced to that was Randall Reed's thesis with Burrus, came out in May of 68, and I've changed the titles to make it more sort of relevant. And then how do you implement an analog filter as a digital filter? This one was Ralph Warmack, whose thesis came out in 68, and fall of 68, and Tom Parks was the advisor. That was using bilinear transforms to map from the Laplace to the Z transform to do, this is where some of the initial ideas for digital filters came from. So in our 5th year, this is the breakout year, this is why we're all here celebrating. 3 things happened, and I'm gonna hand the story over to, after some initial comments here. This is the first DSP courses. That was fall of 69. Again, I labeled it as sort of EE401, but for discrete time. And this was a learning kind of curve. Burrus and Parks were reading the papers 1 or 2 weeks before they taught it, at least in my estimation. Just looking at our notes, you can look at it for yourself, because we were giving out handouts from published journal papers, notes sent to them. During that, about midway through the course, this book came out, Ben Gold and Charlie Rader's book. As far as, it's been a real keepsake for me as a memory of this course. This is the first one, to my knowledge, that had the words digital processing and signals in it. So the modern DSP term as a textbook started in 69. In spring, there was, Parks only taught what I would call signal representations. I look at, that was not his title at the time, it was topics in signal theory. But that set the foundation for a lot of what came afterwards in terms of how do you represent signals efficiently in the presence of noise, deterministically. I think that idea carried forward in terms of wavelets, in terms of sparsity, just how do you represent signals to glean information from it. So those 2 courses in our last year were extremely important. Now, the first publication came out in the first grad students, and at this point I'd like to hand it over to Bob, since he was part of that program. And by the way, Ralph Warmack, we also hosted the 1989 Tau Beta Pi convention, which I think helped put Rice on the map as far as engineering department. So a lot of things were happening in that year to get this program started.
So just quickly, Treichler and I took this 695 course, and Sid comes in mid-semester sometime and says, looks like we've exhausted all of our computer time. So John and I were busily using the teletype that was in Abercrombie. The Burrus 5500, I think, was the first time-sharing machine Rice had. And so we could sit there in Abercrombie and program, and we did lots of DFT processing back and forth to do fast convolution. So I left in 70, came back in 71 and started a PhD program. And my thesis was on periodically time-varying digital filters. And at the time, I recognized that this was a way of basically representing up or down sampling. So you could do, you could use this as a way of describing systems that had multiple sampling rates. Where's the, yeah, let me get this, thanks. So in 69, as many people have alluded to, there wasn't doing much in real-time signal processing. Very small data, very, relatively speaking, slow stuff. I will admit that in 1970 or so, I had not read Gordon Moore's paper from 65. Most of us, at least, didn't foresee the kind of growth that was going to take place. And I had no inkling in 1969, 1970, 71 that, a few decades later, we'd all be walking around with a very sophisticated digital signal processor in our pocket. And I think that's been a huge, huge change in what we've been able to do.
In 1969, I took 2 courses at Rice, which dramatically influenced my life. A course in DSP taught by Sid Burrus and Tom Parks, 2 young engineering professors, and a humanities course about great philosophers taught by Radoslav Sonov, 83-year-old professor at Rice since 1914. The new and the old, the past and the future. These professors had a passion for teaching and learning and changing the world. Last week I photographed this bee with a digital camera, which has a very good noise suppression filter. I have Parkinson's disease, and I shoot handheld, which means I need very high shutter speed, resulting in very high ISO, in this case 12,800, which generates a lot of noise, requiring digital signal processing, DSP, an obscure academic theory in 1969. Today, painting a picture of this bee, part of the exquisite beauty of our planet. Life is good.
Hi, I'm Charlie Leffler. I was a student of Sid Burrus's, probably when he could still count the number of students on both hands, maybe, quite a while ago. And I started in the 70s, and at the beginning of the 80s, Jim and I were appointed to do the 70s. If you go through the slides, you get to guess whose are whose slides. Jim is very organized and meticulous. I tell grandfather stories. And so, I thought we'd first start with what a typical student looked like. And, during the 70s, it was quite the hippie era. We were just building upon what everybody else did. Let's see if I can find out how to do this. So, you want to talk about students?
So Charlie and I really didn't know one another very well. We knew of each other. So the last couple of weeks has been kind of interesting, exchanging emails and trying to figure out exactly what we would do. And, what he just told you about, you'll be able to see who did what. But one of the things that got really interesting was who was here in the 1970s or other decades. So I think Charlie was the first one who accessed the Rice database on this, and then Rich started doing it, and maybe Sidney and others. At some point, we got a list of every master's and PhD thesis in electrical engineering in the history of Rice. First one was 1936. It was a master's. Paul Pfeiffer, who showed up there, was in 1948, and I think he was within the first 5. Okay. The first PhD was Joel Cypress in 1963. Okay. And so in the 70s is when it really started to become a graduate program. So things are divided here a little bit. We included the 60s people who actually left the 5th-year program in 1970, Larry Marple, John Treichler, Hugh South, who I don't think I've met yet, there he is, and Wanda Gass, who is apparently on the Board of Supervisors or whatever you call it at Rice.
She's where I'm supposed to be.
Okay, all right. So here's a list of the master's thesis titles from the 1970s. And I thought putting this up at the beginning and not reading it to you, but you can kind of look at the list and see who was there, and you can start to see some of the titles that tell you a little bit of what was going on in that era. The next one of these is the PhD titles. And if you go into the Rice database, and it took me a while to realize this, all the PhDs are listed in caps. But they also, in general, have no thesis supervisor attached to them. So that's why you can't tell who did this. But as near as I can tell, the first one, Fernando Soto, Sid's student, he was really the first PhD that did things related to DSP, right? Is that fair to say? And Randy Reed, who was here, certainly did things of that sort, and he overlapped just a bit with me. I included a couple of others that maybe shouldn't be on this list. Candy Anderson in 1977 was my office mate, but ended up, I think, working with John in California later in her career. Bob Meyer, Ramesh Agarwal was a phenomenal student in the 70s. John Fisher went to be a doctor after he did his thesis. And Dean Kolba, I guess, kind of wrapped up the end of that era with his thesis. So one of the things they said, you know, in doing this talk about classes. So I'm going to give you my take on classes. You can figure out how Charlie is a very astute observer of human behavior. I know you through the comments, right? So EE 531 was what it was called in the fall of 1970, I'm sorry. What I remember about that class is one of the ideas thrown out after Ardenhouse was, what are the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the DFT matrix? And I don't know if it was a homework problem, but it was just kind of thrown out as an idea. For me, that ended up being the first paper that Tom Parks and I wrote. You can say something about APL and the like. Sidney became fascinated with APL, I think, in the mid-70s, right?
If I remember, APL was created as a language that would precisely describe mathematical equations. And somehow it also got connected to that tendency of computer programmer geeks to write the shortest program that you cannot read that's possible. And I don't know who did this. None of the professors would fess up. Well, they had a one-line DFT, one-line APL DFT program that we had to figure out what it did. They didn't tell us it was DFT. And then there was a four-liner or five-liner, I don't remember, FFT algorithm. So, you know, a lot of impactful stuff in that course, and what I remember is those two homework problems.
So why don't you continue saying things about the other courses?
So all of us took Tom Parks's signal theory course. It's one of the ones I love the most. My current job is with underwater acoustics, and when I started it, I thought I was going to do all these kind of things that Tom talked about in signal theory. Of course, I used a lot of it. But things I really remember out the course is Tom walking into one of the air-conditioned rooms in the old mechanical engineering building, taking his notebook, flipping it open to a random page, and picking what lecture he would do that day. I also remember one day where there was a really terrible smell, and he commented about it a couple times, and then we were writing something he had just said, and we looked up and he was gone. One of us went out in the hallway right away to find him, and he was gone. You know, we just disappeared. He one time walked into the classroom and looked at the board and was really excited. The whole board was filled with equations. He erased all of it except the last equation, and he developed his lecture so it would end up on that equation, changing the notation on the fly. You guys did the... So what I remember about signal theory, which is what Tom called the course, there was a book that Lou Franks had written that was entitled the same thing. And this
kind of wraps into Richard Tapia. When I got here, I was really interested in mathematics. In fact, I had toyed with the idea of going to grad school in mathematics. So I felt once I got here, I had kind of landed in the right place, because between Tom and Richard Tapia, everything was in linear vector spaces. Everything was in Hilbert space. You did approximations in all sorts of different norms and the like. And that was how you described these very general ideas about signals, which of course has become now commonplace in how we think about that. One of the things in the signal theory course, so that's the spring of '71, Tom had gone to the Princeton conference where he saw a paper on filter design that Al Oppenheim, Ed Hofstadter, and Joe Siegel had written and presented at that conference. He brought that back, and we had to do a course project in that class. And so I ended up taking that paper and using that as my course project. And it quickly became our filter design algorithm. So for me, 531 and 532 turned out great. I got 2 publications in my first year in graduate school, which was like, wow. Richard Tapia was another young professor who showed up here, I believe, in the fall of 1970. I'm not sure. He was in what Rice called the math science program. So if you're a Rice person, you know about that. But it was a renaming of applied math. And he taught a course on optimization, which again was this idea that you look at it in a very abstract way. And most classes in optimization and engineering, mathematics, and the like were very dull in some sense in those days. They were very limited. And Richard's view of the world was really complemented what Tom and I were doing. I'll let you.
Yeah, my experience with Tapia was later in my graduate career. Sid called me into his office like he would do every once in a while. And those of you know Sid, he gets that serious look and he scrunches really hard. And he says, Tapia's teaching a course this year. And apparently he hadn't for a number of years. And I said, great. And he says, you have to take it. I asked what it was. He said, I don't know. He was right. It was his optimization course. It was an excellent course. It was my course on math proofs, really. That's where I ended up to do it. Very appreciative of that later on in my career. It was challenging at the time. And Sid also had his infamous network synthesis course, which I sat in on. My most significant memory, because this was the peak of his enthusiasm, was he would draw a box on the board, and that was, of course, a circuit that we didn't know quite what it was yet. And you wanted to figure out if the transfer function was positive or positive definite or something like that. Lord knows, I have no idea. And he would stand here, and he would start pulling on the line that went into that box. And he was pulling out the first impedance. And he would pull and pull and pull. And then over here, he had an equation that he'd fool with, and he'd manipulate it. And there'd be this point where he'd pull it, and suddenly it would pop. And a whole pole or zero, Lord knows, came out. And then this equation stayed positive definite, and he was just ecstatic, and that was the end of the class.
And it was at 8 in the morning.
Yeah, I got up at 5. I don't remember that kind of stuff, you know.
So let me say something.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So my memory of that is, yeah, it was at 8 in the morning, which was just not reasonable at all. But somewhere back before I came to Rice, I had this idea that I was, if I was going to do an electrical engineering PhD, it was going to be in network synthesis, okay? And in fact, the most famous book in network synthesis was written by Tuttle, who was Sidney's PhD advisor. So I just had to take this course, even though it was 8 in the morning. All right, I got a couple of pictures here. This is a picture of Tom, Parks, Martha, and I in 1997 after an ICASP when we took a tour through Austria after the conference, enjoying beer, as all of us do. This is one that Ron Schaefer took of me when he was putting together a talk about history of DSP, and this gets back to, how did we interact with computers? So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, this card deck was probably the nearest thing I had in those days to an iPad. It was with me all the time, and you're always fiddling with it and the like. The other aspect of it is, in those days, you got one run a day. If you were willing to drive in here at 9 at night, or 10 o'clock at night, you could get 2 runs, okay? And so there was a lot of thinking in between modifying code in those days. Whereas nowadays, you just say, well, is this going to work? No, it doesn't work. Let's try something else. Okay, I want to say a little bit about research. This was the other thing that we were asked to think about. The big research questions of the 1970s, what did people worry about? And this is more or less my own take on it. Filter design was a big deal. My younger colleagues now tell me, why do we need to teach filter design anymore? So it's run its course. For years and years, ICASP had many, many sessions on filter design. It quickly became 2D filter design, a bigger, larger optimization problem. We had some luck with designing filters via transformations. This more or less came out of the geophysics industry, and my recollection of this was John Shanks coming here and Sven Treitel and giving talks on how the oil industry was designing filters for what they wanted to do. Another big deal in the 70s was implementation, and this was, I think a lot of Sidney's students did this, time-varying filters, rate-changing filters. Tom Parks did digital interpolators, and I started thinking about it, and I thought, underlying the way we thought about the world in the 70s is multiplications were a huge issue. And so implementations, everything of those kind of research, you counted multiplies. The FFT was important because it had many, many less multiplies. The other way I like to think about things is, are there certain splash events that really get everybody's attention? In the mid-70s, there was this thing called the Winograd Fourier transform algorithm. Sam Winograd at IBM Research had supposedly invented this way of doing the FFT faster. It relied on number theory and gave rise to a lot of research here on what was called the prime factor algorithm, because this worked very well if the number wasn't a power of 2, but was a product of primes. When I left here and Tom went on sabbatical that year, we went to Lincoln Labs, and number theory transforms were a big deal. Number theory transforms were great because it wasn't e to the j anymore, it was 2 to the n. And 2 to the n in hardware is a whole lot easier than e to the j. At Lincoln Labs, one way you could see this idea that multipliers were a problem is the group there built a 16K FFT for a radar matched filter that had to run at radar rates, which was 50 megahertz or something in that range. To avoid multiplies, we used a method called the Cordic rotation, which allows you to do a sequence of adds, and the sequence involves powers of 2, and that whole system was built around that idea. The actual device was probably as big as about this much of the room. Okay. And then the other big splash from my point of view was linear prediction, and that's already been mentioned. But John McCool's paper in the middle 70s was a really big deal, because all of a sudden signal representations that you could get from the data on the fly could be done. And I remember when I was teaching at MIT, deciding very quickly that that had to be part of the DSP course that we taught. J.D. Wise did his thesis on things related to that. Then something happened. Wasn't TI, but it was the multiplier. Somebody finally built a single chip multiplier, TRW. And it consumed 5 watts of power, so you had to be careful with it. But that was the beginning of saying you could put all of this stuff together on one chip. And the people from the 80s will tell you all about that.
Hold for a second. So one of the things is that we have been working on how to do, when I was here, how to do filters without multipliers and distributed arithmetic and all kinds of strange little things. And this came out, and somebody came and gave a talk, and they had built a radio with 23 or 28 of those. We were trying to figure out how to use one, and that was going to be so cool. And 23 or 28, you didn't give the talk, I would have remembered it, but, and I have no idea what the real number is. But, yeah, well, you're lying. I don't know. But it was extraordinary. Whoever gave the talk gave some of these out. This is mine, and I'm going to do something with it someday.
Eat your house.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, now for the fun stuff.
I'm doing this? Okay.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so the things that happened, people were walking on the moon. We saw the thing on 69. I was in junior high school. I can remember exactly where I was the moment that television program came out, or television thing. Kent State shootings, where the National Guard shot a number of students, made Newsweek cover, if I remember right. There's a comment in here about Stockham's Nixon tapes.
Yeah,
He also analyzed the audio tapes from Kent State, which was a student who hung his microphones outside of his dorm room, facing away from the incident, and he could figure out where the localized shots were. Vietnam War finally ended. That was significant for most of us during that time, and most of us had gone through the lottery system. Your Watergate.
So in the email change that went around, Bob Meyer reminded me of something at the 1974 Arden House, which was the first one that he and I attended. And there was an analysis of the Nixon tapes that was done by a group of experts. Tom Stockham was one of those. And Tom had just testified before Judge Sirica's court about that in, this was early 1974. And he came to Arden House late that day. And in the evening, we were all sitting around, and he started telling stories about what they had done and how they had done it. And it was just absolutely fascinating, and to realize that, this was the field in which we were practicing or about to be practicing. It was just amazing. ICAST started in 1976, so the Arden House became too small to do what we were doing. Then the cute things, Elvis died, 3 Mile Island. How many of you remember the birds here at Rice? Okay. So Rice used to be invaded by these black birds at various times of the year. And you basically couldn't walk from Abercrombie across that triangle to what I think of as the Mass Science Building, because there were so many birds. I thank my wife for reminding me of this, because that's one of her memories of saying, yeah, I used to hate to go down to the campus because of all the dang birds.
Yeah, one of the things about the birds is there was a graduate student when I was here who was supposed to count the number of birds on Rice campus, and she laid on her back with a, hole in a piece of paper, looking up, counting birds crossing through, presumably with her mouth shut. Rice really flooded, for sure, at least one of those times. 2 of the very serious ECE graduate students swam to campus so they could work on the computers, so they could finish their work. Not surprisingly, the computers weren't working. We weren't that smart in the 70s. And then there also was Tom worked on the Kennedy assassination tapes. And for those of you who don't know, there was a Harley Davidson motorcycle, one of the policemen left his mic on. The mic's hanging down near the engine, and the recording is back over the radio back at the station. So they weren't that high quality tapes. A few more serious things. There were no calculators in any of the classes back then.
Yeah, so this is the early 70s again. And finally, there were calculators about that time. The HP 35 is the most well-known of these. It costs $395, which I figure in today's dollars is probably $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000. But I looked this up. I was trying to figure out, now, who did the first calculator? And I'm reading the Wikipedia page, and of course, the name Kilby jumps out at me. I'm thinking, what does Jack Kilby have to do with calculators? And here's the citation from the Wikipedia page, and I guess I need Gene France to tell me the whole story of this. But obviously, something where the output device was paper tape probably wasn't going to last very long. But I think this did lead to TI's patents on the calculators.
And we all, that's when the computers started up. Significance for me is that was a summer I started with Sid, and Sid made me build a computer for him. It was a Kremenko. There wasn't Amazon then, so the substitute that was to get in the passenger seat of Sid's car, drive to some ma and pa shop in Austin, buy a 4K memory board that you had to solder all the chips in, so he could be, and then debug it, of course, and then he could be ecstatic that he had now 4K of memory on his machine. We experimented with a whole lot of different audio cassette players to find the ones that would work with the different schemes. Also, real significant for the graduate students at the time is Kinko's opened. The significant thing is Kinko's business model is they clean their machines every night. I know. Good try. So you could get really good thesis copies. And if you gave them a six-pack, you could be the first one to get your thesis copy. Now, you did ask for foundational things into the future, or things we did that really produced into the future. We created the home run softball team, really Sarah Riley and her husband, then eventually husband Jim Ontos. A significant event is during one of the games, one of the graduate students, Charlie Hu, got a hit and made it to first base, which meant everybody said, who's on first? We did. I mean, it was pretty pitiful. And the other thing that's happened is Valhalla opened. And that was going on in the email list. And that was going on through the email list, and I know a little bit more about it than my brother does. So 3 things were going on at that time. One, apparently there was a big argument on campus of whether you could serve alcohol here, and a glorious decision was that the graduate students could drink alcohol on campus. 2, the paint shop underneath the stairs of the chemistry building was going to be emptied out and moved. And 3, the Cohen House, I think, was being renovated. A set of chemistry graduate students went and saved the oak furniture from the Cohen House that's along the walls and the bar. And those graduate students, and this is why I know it, is Paul Leffler, my brother, who is a graduate student in chemistry, Bill Buckenall, his best buddy Lee Albright, and Fred somebody. And Paul doesn't know who Fred is, and surely I don't. And the other detail, just to throw in for me, is Paul, my brother, learned all his woodworking skills to install that from his dad, obviously my dad, Edward Leffler, who is class of 41 from Rice. So I'd like to thank the graduate students of chemistry for Valhalla. And last thing, both Jim and I do agree, we'd like to thank Sid, Tom, Rui, Don, and the rest of y'all for starting the program at Rice, tolerating us and getting us through, and a lot of beginnings with a lot of ends elsewhere. Stuff I'm hidden from this community in general for what I do, but there are things that Sid taught me that have been at one time on every U.S. submarine, algorithms from Sid's, and made things work that never worked before. So thank you, guys.
Hi, my name is Faye Boudreau, and before I start, I just wanted to thank these guys over here who we had a lot of interesting conversations along with Doug Jones in the back on reliving some memories from Rice, including the Ohm Runs softball team. And there's some story about cricket players on the softball team that I don't quite understand, but you should ask them about that. And the other thing was about old computer games that everybody was playing when they should have been studying or should have been home with the kids. And so it was a very fun era, and we all were blessed with many wonderful teachers. I think some of the best teachers I have had in my lifetime that I try to emulate as well. But I'm going to try and stick to the 7-minute time limit that that Rich gave us, and so there won't be quite as many pictures and detailed information as before, but hopefully you'll get a good feel for what's going on. So one of the questions he asked us was who was studying at Rice, and so we put together this list, and it was not easy to do because amazingly Rice does not keep track of who were PhD advisors or even sometimes the master's advisors. So for Sid Burrus during that time was Charlie Leffler, Shuni Chu, Howard Coleman, Howie Johnson, Michael Heidemann, and Henrik Sorensen. Tom Parks was my advisor along with Galamabus, who is here, but not in the front. Come on up. Dave Scheibner, Robert McCaslin, Sergio Cabrera, Doug Jones, who's in the back, and Sean McCaslin. And then also what kept on coming up was a lot of Rui deFigueredo's students, Sarah Rahala, Tom Brustowitz, Bud Wendt, Jiangling Hu, Ray Seymour, Hemant Tagore, Nasser, Basam, Trung Tat, Sunil, and Jitendra. And then Don Johnson also, and I apologize if I got some of these names wrong because I had, as I said, they didn't have their advisors listed, so I had to do some searching and my best guess. I remember Anatharam Swami, I shared an office with him, and he wrote poetry, just amazingly bright individual, but all of his poems he wrote on the board, and they were all about death, and that was my first year of grad school. Stuart DeGraff, Darcy McGinn, Daryl Lineberger's here, Anand Ramachandran Kumar, Srinivasa Rao, and Doug Williams, who is here. And then also Azong students towards the end of that decade, including Jeffrey Orsak, who's up front. So Rich also asked us what topics were we researching, and so I'm a very visual person, so I apologize in advance for this next slide, which you will probably not be able to read, but look at the check marks. All right. So this is a list chronologically of all of the degrees that were offered in that decade. And you already saw who the people were in the first few columns, but you'll see that the information is, we were mostly interested at the beginning on fast algorithms or efficient. McClellan talked about multiplierless filters or filters that didn't take a lot of memory. I remember the program that I wrote for my master's, I had to overlay memory 3 different times in order to get it to fit into the computer and run so that I could implement a 100th order filter. That was a big deal. Point processes, equalizers and channels. Tom Parks got interested in Schlumberger, and so there was work with a lot of geophysics and arrays and radar. There was a lot of work on parameter estimation and modeling, not only for deterministic signals using Prony's methods and other methods, but also for stochastic systems, spectrum estimation. A lot of deFigueredo students were interested in some sort of image processing for different applications. There was work on Fourier transforms, and there also was work on time frequency representations. And so this next slide actually brought back a couple of memories for me when I was at Rice. There are 2 things I remember specifically about Tom Parks. And one was that Sid and Don were just fantastic teachers and extroverts, and you could tell they just loved being in the front of the classroom, and it was a stage, and they were performing. Sid always had a piece of chalk in his hand that he pointed at us, and Don was always just so excited about what he was teaching. But Tom Parks was a bit more of an introvert. And so he was not quite as comfortable in the front of the class as the others. And one thing that he would do when he was kind of talking is he would walk backwards a lot when he was teaching. And he sort of wouldn't keep track of where he was. And the other thing was he always had chalk at the end of the class. He had chalk in his hair. He wore dark blue pants and the same shirt every day. And he'd come out of class and there was just white all around his pockets because he'd go through his hair, he'd stick his hand in his pocket, he'd look for the chalk. And he was just a fun teacher to watch. But the other thing I'm remembering that was really special is when he would be walking backwards, he'd lose track of where he was, and he often ended up walking into the trash can. And then he'd fumble out and he'd stand out. But the second thing that I remember about him was his admonishment to me and I think some of the other students that we needed to be more like Jim McClellan. And so when I saw McClellan had put a list together of all of the masters and students and their topics, I thought, well, okay, I'll do that too. And so here's to Tom. And so you have a list here of the master's students, and you can see that they start out with a lot of filters and optimal algorithms, and then they venture on. And then we also put together the list of the PhD students, and that took 2 slides. And again, as I said, I'm very visual, and I was trying to figure out where there were that many more PhD students than there were master's students. And they were exactly the same. The difference was that the PhD students all had titles that were 2 or 3 times as long as the master's students. So there's that information. And then we were the first sort of generation to really benefit from a lot of the new technology that was happening with computers at the time and with applications of signal processing. So there were a lot of changes in the 80s in that decade. And in particular, right around the time in the early 80s or when the personal computers were starting to come out, the Ibm Pc 5150 was one of the first, and I think it cost $2,000 back in 1981. I remember when I started my first job, one of the things in the startup package was a personal computer for my desk, and it was a month-and-a-half salary equivalent for that personal computer. They were still very expensive. MS-DOS came out in 1981. The Macintosh came out in 1984, and it had a graphical user interface, and it had a mouse, and that was a big deal back then. We walked around with our Walkmans playing cassette tapes until CD players came out in about 1982, and at that time, CDs started outselling vinyl as well as cassette tapes, so that was a big transition there. There were VCRs and camcorders that were coming out, and as I mentioned, the video game consoles, Pac-Man came out in 1980, Game Boy in 1989, and I think Daryl and Mike Heidemann are the experts on the computer games that were available on the Rice computers. Cable television came out in that decade. It's hard to believe, but there weren't answering phones back then, and so if you were trying to get in touch with somebody, you had to stay home by your phone because there weren't answering machines. Cell phones were coming out, although you can see it was a big clunker of one up in the upper left-hand corner there. Fax machines, and the internet went global. I can remember Don Johnson giving a short course at an ICASP on teaching us all how to use the internet. And so that was a big thing at the end of that decade. So we also had fun thinking about other things that had happened at Rice and in the world at that time. And so we put our brains together and came up with a list of some things that were happening that impacted us as students. The first was that in the 1980s and 81s, it was a very stressful year for a variety of things. There were wars going on, or wars that had ended. Presidents were being shot. And interest rates were 21.5% in 1980. I remember one of my office mates, Mike Heidemann, had bought a house. He had 3 kids. And he was amazing. He worked 40 hours a week, and then he did his research at night with 3 kids. But his mortgage was 18% in 1980. The price of gas had doubled in 2 years in 1981. Well, actually, it doubled in 4 years, but it went up 60% in just 1.5 years. And so we were all worried about money and how we were going to survive on our meager student stipend. The good news was Valhalla was selling beer for 35 cents a cup, and peanuts were 5 cents a bag, and that was often dinner for many of us. In 1982, as was mentioned, the TMS 30-2010 came out. A big event was Hurricane Alicia passed over Houston, and there was a lot of flooding and damage. In 1984, MATLAB 1.0 came out. And in 85 and 86, Rice gained a professor in signal processing and then lost a professor. So Zhang started in 85, but Tom Parks left in 86 and went over to Cornell. For those of us in the early 80s, we never saw the monoliths. The 45, 90, and 180-degree monolith were installed in the Rice Quad. And Halley's Comet was a big event that only happens every 75 years or so. So that was a big memory. And then the big laugh that decade was that the year 1988, when the statue of William Marsh Rice in front of the library was turned around overnight. But we were all innocent because we were at ICASP 88. So we also started thinking about what was going on in the national scene and putting together some concepts that might be of interest or draw back some memories. It was a really good walk down memory lane. The list was about twice the length it was now, and Daryl said it's too depressing. So he made me take all of the bad things out. And so we still have a few things left. In the 1980s, Rubik's Cubes were invented. And I remember vividly Howie Johnson in the office, and he had a lot of energy, and he was just incredibly brilliant, and he would be writing and doing research, and he'd be flicking his little Rubik's Cube the same time, and we all just kind of sat there shaking our head, because it goes click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. And there were 4 of us in the office at the time, Daryl and Merchant and Sergio. And so it was pretty noisy. The U.S. boycotted the Olympics in Moscow that year, and Mount St. Helens erupted. In 81, the hostage crisis ended right after President Reagan was signed in, conveniently, and 60 Americans were released. The first flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia took place, and the first intravenous, what's the word? Thank you, not intravenous, that would be amazing. The first IV baby was born. In 82, the Vietnam War Memorial opened in DC. Genetically engineered human insulin became available for the first time. And strangely, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands and caused a war with the UK. I never understood that one. In 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space, and SDI was first proposed by Reagan, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The next year, DNA profiling was developed. In 85, Bob Ballard discovered the Titanic. New Coke was released. I don't know if any of you remember that. That was a disaster. Coke changed its formula. And Blockbusters opened a store where you could rent VCR movies. And Michael Jordan was named Rookie of the Year. In 86, the NASA Challenger exploded. The USSR started the Mir space station, and the Human Genome Project was launched. And then in 87 was what's known as Black October. The stock market plunged and lost 22.6% of its value in less than a week. And luckily, that same year, Prozac was marketed. And then the last 2 years, the INF treaty was signed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Crack cocaine appears for the first time in U.S. cities. Poland had massive labor strikes called the Solidarity Supporters. The Iran-Iraq War ended. And the next year, the Berlin Wall fell. The Exxon Valdez spilt millions of gallons of oil off the coast of Alaska. And Tiananmen Square's student protest happened as well. Thank you.
So this is the 90s, a decade of change. We started the 90s with the Oilers in Houston, and we ended the 90s going to 2000s with the Texans in Houston. The Astrodome still exists, albeit in a decrepit state, and now we have a new stadium. And I think you'll notice a football theme. It was in the 90s that we started playing electrical engineering football, flag football, every Friday with Benham and Rich and some of the faculty out there. That was a fun time until we broke that collarbone of that MBA student. Yeah. Also in the 90s, Dr. Burrus was named Dean of Engineering, so that was a change. We noticed, though, as we went through pictures, we had to go back a long way to find a picture of Dr. Burrus. It looks different from what he looks like now. So some things don't ever change. They always stay the same. It was a decade of firsts. It was in 1984 that Rice defeated Texas for the first time in forever. Ever, yeah. 1917 to be one of the co-champions of the Southwest Conference that year, the last year the Southwest Conference existed. So as the Southwest Conference dissolved, Rice was on history as one of the last champions of the Southwest Conference. Rich Baranek joined Rice in 1993. Rob Nowak joined Rice twice in the 90s. It was a decade of innovation. Lots of faculty members, but we wanted to list, Dr. Burrus, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Baranek, and we wanted to talk about mentoring a little bit. There was so much knowledge that was transferred, so much research and techniques and cutting-edge things, but as we worked last night into the morning, and more and more beer was consumed, one of the themes that we really centered on was mentorship, and that these professors were mentors to us, and not just in terms of our research, but in teaching us to be mentors to the next generation of students. So many of us walked away from last evening really realizing that the impacts that we have had and the mentoring that we've done is a function of the mentoring that was provided to us to show us how important that was in our journey here at Rice. So we want to thank you and others too, but just three individuals there just to get a taste of the type of faculty that we were working with in that time frame. Some of the hot research topics, feel free to jump in here, anyone, but clearly in the 90s, wavelets and filter banks were a big topic that really hit the scene. We did work in hidden Markov models. There was work in multifractals and networks.
I think Ivan has a multifractal joke. There's a microphone.
Benoit B. Mandelbrot, right? Do you know what the B stands for? Benoit B. Mandelbrot.
There was work done in DSL. Rohit gets paid, although I don't know if options count necessarily. Image compression, the ECT algorithm, time frequency analysis, support vector machines, approximation theory, neuroengineering. These are just some of the topics that we were brainstorming last night that we were working on, that were being worked on, that were very exciting topics in that time frame in the 90s. The Rice Wavelet Toolbox was developed in the 90s. Now, unfortunately, I think we've got some legal words we can use on Wavelet Toolbox, but that was the first development of code here at Rice for MATLAB to use to actually put those wavelet tools into a way that others could use them. And sometimes still today, they do that. It was a decade of education. We went through and talked about our favorite courses. As you notice, 531, I think, was in every decade, as you're going to see. But it was at the top of our list as well. Very foundational. It's the first time that many of us got to work closely with Dr. Burrus, who weren't his students. And, I don't have to tell you about 531 because you've probably all taken 531 from Dr. Burrus. Real analysis, functional analysis, intro to math analysis, linear systems with Antoulis. There was a lot of talk about Professor Antoulis and how much fun we had in linear systems, and the fact that once you took Antoulis' class, you really looked at the world and all the problems that you're looking at in a different way based on that class. Detection theory, we couldn't remember the number. Was it 530? 530. Spectral estimation theory with Dr. Baranek. We always like elect 599s. Optimization theory, still popular. And of course, we couldn't leave without maybe the Bat Boy and the Leningrad Cowboys. Here are some of the books that we were reading in that time frame. Obviously, Dobishi's 10 lectures, Dr. Burrus's book on Wavelet's primer. These are just some of the PPV's book on multi-rate filter banks. And of course, a PhD is not enough. I think was required reading if you were one of Dr. Berenek's students.
I think we brought the 10 lectures book to Neil when he was in the hospital after he tore his ACL. Give him a way to pass the time.
And one of the things that was interesting, as we put the Fast Fourier Transforms book up there last night, Ivan comes over and says, "Wait, I've never seen that. My name's on that." It was also a decade of wisdom. They all are, but these are the pieces of wisdom that we collectively walked away with. Know what's important and what's not. To enjoy life. Like I talked about, we played football almost every Friday. We took the break and we'd go have fun as a group. Some of us learned that 1C doesn't matter. That's recoverable. And that kind of goes into don't take yourself too seriously. A PhD is not enough. And then we referenced the book earlier. What do you want to do when you grow up? Was a question that was asked of us many times, and try to put things in perspective. What is the real problem you're trying to solve? But one of the important things we walked away with is that Rice is family. And at first it was Rice is a family, but no, that's not paramount. Rice is family. And the things we did, the experiences we had, the wisdom we learned, is because we bonded. And I don't know about others, but I think all of us probably share that when we first came here, what attracted us to Rice, the beautiful campus, beautiful city, but it was the people and the family that we were joining when we came here that really sold the program to us. Now, there's some other wisdom as well. Matt contributed. When Rich asks you a question, maybe if you wait, the question will go away.
Yeah, basically, go ahead. Basically, I wanted to graduate, and Rich is such a whirlwind of ideas and activity. And, I want to get my thesis done, so I'm decided, if Rich gives you a great research idea, well, just ignore it. If it's a really great one, he'll ask you again, and then you can work on it. Otherwise, just finish your thesis.
And we have a current example of that. Yesterday, the email came out from Rich that we were going to write the lyrics to a DSP 50 song. And we waited, and then about an hour later, no, we're not doing that. So, good. That worked out well. And I guess my wisdom was that if you wait to the last minute, then by definition, it only takes a minute. But the bottom line is that all of us left here with a great deal of memories. And so these are the 7 of us that worked last night into the morning to put this together. But we want to include all the others who were part of that decade who had the wisdom to avoid getting roped into building this presentation. And I think we're ahead of time, so did anyone else have anything they wanted to add? Because not all of us were able to be there last night. So.
Yeah, I would add something. I'm Owen Kelly.
Are you going to apologize for something?
If that's the protocol. So I'm glad to be here. There was a connection between, 2 connections really between us on the topic of having fun in life and what goes on outside the campus. That when I was here at Rice, my wife was fortunate enough to work at the Contemporary Arts Museum. And so whenever there was an event, she would give me a handful of tickets and, whatever the favors were. And I would distribute them in the department in the hopes of raising attendance at the Contemporary Arts Museum and peeling the students away from their desks. So maybe that happened sometimes, which was great. And another thing, through Dawn's wife, Katie, who was working in IT, Rice was kind enough to host the website of the Contemporary Arts Museum. And so in terms of that, pioneering frontier of getting the fruits of our labors out into the world, I think the Contemporary Arts Museum at Houston, their website might have been one of the first 100 online in the world, or first 1,000. I mean, it was really, really early, and they were handcrafting HTML, with a few pictures or whatever, and that was through that connection. And also some artists got their first chances to use a web browser, like the art guys. There's some, so that's one of my recollections for what happened off campus.
Thank you much.
So yeah, while all the 2000s people, half the room kind of filters up here. So I started here as an undergrad in 2000, in August of 2000. I left exactly 10 years later in 2010. I got out 2 days before the 10th anniversary of matriculating. So I had no choice but to represent the 2000s, which kind of began, I think, with the sort of most important event of the decade that didn't actually happen, which was, of course, Y2K, which, you know, planes fell from the sky. We got over it. But then some things that I think, you know, if you look back, what happened in 2000, I think two things that kind of resonate with people here in DSP. First was Wikipedia went online. And then also it was the first year of the iPad. Very first iPad. Look at how ugly it is. Sorry, iPod. Yeah, it's yeah. And then I thought for sure I was going to make the first hanging Chad joke, but someone already referenced that amazingly. So okay. So also the N-Phase boys returned from their European tour. Is Ray Wagner here? No, he's not here. So Ray will be here later. They thought this website was taken down, but it turns out it was not. And Rice had not yet won a national championship for some reason. I don't know what it is. But this was actually a photo at the third game of the College World Series in 2010, or 2003. All right, so more broadly, Rice also hosted luminaries like Vladimir Putin and Alan Greenspan at the Baker Institute. This is in 2001. I actually went to both of these, so I remember Putin talked about a new era of openness and cooperation. And Alan Greenspan talked about mastering the business cycle and how the Federal Reserve had really, achieved this great mastery, which I think, subsequent events certainly proved to be true. All right, so who is at Rice? I can first, I have to start. Sid Burrus was still dean. I was going to say that this picture was taken in 2004, but that's already been revealed to be not true. So Sid Burrus was dean. From my perspective, Sid Burrus was kind of a figurehead, and we all know who was really running the show back then was Liz Hickman, who is not here today. But all right, so among the faculty, we had a lot of kind of familiar faces, but some new people joined. So I think we have Hyoko. Kevin Kelly is not exactly DSP, but he's honorary. I think he joined in the 2000s. And yeah, Mike Orchard, Rolf Reedy. We had kind of a lot of good faculty, but then also a stream of visiting faculty. So we have Ubli here, Pyotr Indyk from 2009. This is actually him at the Houston Rodeo. And then we also had in kind of 2005, I guess, Ron DeVore and Albert Cohen, who are sort of mathematics odd couple, showed up and really actually helped kickstart all of the activity at Rice related to compressed sensing, which I'll mention briefly in a bit. But there was also a stream of postdocs and students. So I tried to grab pictures of all the postdocs that I could find. But then the students, when it comes to students, everyone else had these nice tables of what everyone was doing. So I actually looked up in the spreadsheet that Rich sent. There are 142 students who received their master's or PhD from Rice during this decade. So I'm by no means going to cover everyone. So I did try to find some nice contemporary pictures. You can see baby Justin up here in the corner. This is right after his thesis defense, yes. So Becca is here, Laura, Chris, Neil. There's a kind of a nice selection here of different people. I wanted to also make sure everyone can see that one of the things we spent a lot of time on, perhaps unwisely, was doing bizarre Photoshop art projects. And so for Mike Wakin's PhD defense, two of the committee members, Ron DeVore and Dave Donahoe couldn't make it, couldn't appear in person, so we made life-size cardboard cutouts of them. But of course, we couldn't find full body shots, so we had to substitute with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker here. And then, yeah, we have kind of really just a long list of students who've gone on already to do kind of mostly successful careers, along with Mike Waken here, who is inexplicably lying on a field in Corsica with a cow. I don't know anything about that picture, but all right. So what was being taught? So I think all the stuff people have already been mentioning was still being taught. So 531 was still very active. I took a course from Richard Tapia on convex optimization. At that time, he had been promoted to university professor, and so he was teaching 2 courses. One was on convex optimization in the math department, and one was in, I think, the English department on Chicano studies. And we like to always joke that when you signed up for optimization theory, what you really got was a course on Chicano studies. And when people signed up for the Chicano studies, unfortunately, they really learned a lot more about optimization than they expected. But when we were talking about, what really, how to kind of highlight what was being taught, we focused on this special topics course, this ELEC 631 course, which kind of what it was changed from semester to semester, or from year to year. And we tried to, figure out what was being taught in all of them, but unfortunately, Rice doesn't seem to keep any records of this. It's just sort of whatever happens in this classroom. It just stays in there. So we put up what we could remember, but then also, fortunately, I was able to look up a lot of this in the Mueller report. But there's a lot of redactions, so you're going to have to, maybe some of you can remember. But I think the one that I'll mention just as a highlight is that you can kind of see halfway through. So we started out talking about kind of high-dimensional signal models. Later on, started kind of focusing on efficient algorithms and sampling and things like that. And right in the middle, we have this idea of compressed sensing, which if you had to pick one research area that was really an active area in this decade, I certainly can't summarize what 142 people did. But a lot of people worked on this compressed sensing problem, this idea of how do we recover some kind of structured high-dimensional signal or solve some system of equations when we have fewer observations than unknowns by using sparsity. So this has many, many applications. The one that got the most press at the time was the single-pixel camera. I think maybe I won't say too much more since we're already eating into lunch, except to say that I think this summarizes that decade to such an extent that when I graduated, the only thing that people could think of as a graduation gift was just to give me a T-shirt with this printed on it. And so, so Rich wanted us to comment on where these ideas are now, and I would say, unlike previous decades who can say, oh, well, now everyone's carrying something in their pocket. Everyone is not carrying compressed sensing in your pocket yet. But it is something that I think, at the very least, has some, still an ongoing area of research, in fact, but it also has had some concrete results. The one I want to point out is that Siemens has actually licensed a bunch of patents from Rice related to these ideas. So it is at least being used in medical imaging. It was already being used in the oil industry, and they're still doing it. So, all right. So the other thing that happened in this decade was a lot of us started going to this Neural Information Processing Systems conference. And in the middle of the decade, people started talking about deep learning. And I think we all concluded that there was no future in that. So we all moved on. And then, so I just wanted to also mention a couple of other things that maybe aren't even really about research, but so connections, this idea of open source education, open education really took off. And this is a photo from Rich's TED Talk where he opened for Peter Gabriel. Yeah, so you're open for Peter Gabriel, highlight of his career. This is also on the subject of open resources. We started an open source journal called Rejecta Mathematica, only journal that only publishes rejected papers. We had a really good first issue. People seem to lose interest, but it's the 10-year anniversary. We're thinking about restarting if anyone's got something. It was also the decade closed with the first successful ICASP challenge experiment. I will explain later if people are interested. And so what I'm going to conclude with is actually just a selection of biophotos that starts a little bit before our decade and continues after. This was really the golden age of ridiculous biophotos. So much to the extent I don't even get some of the jokes in some of these. I'll just hover on some of them, but what I kind of want to emphasize is, so some of these are very subtle, right? Like they've got pool cues up here in this one, and this is a paper about Minimax classification, and we found a Minimax drive in Houston and took photos in front of signs. Some of them are less subtle, but Rich, or more broadly, rice has become so notorious for this. I'm actually a little hesitant to speak about this in front of our Signal Processing Society representatives, but I guess we'll see. So this paper, I guess I'll just mention this paper, this upper right paper. I mean, you can stare at it for a while. See if you can even figure out what's wrong with this. The IEEE Publications Department, this actually pushed back about these biophotos, and in their response email pointed out that they give extra scrutiny to any papers coming from rice. And so the first author never went to Rice, and these other authors, so Chris and Mike, actually graduated 7 years before this paper was even submitted. And so they have like some academic genealogy chart pinned up to kind of go through. And somehow this got through. I don't understand. Okay. So this keeps going. I'll go ahead and, I think this was the last one. So I guess we're almost done. I don't know if anyone else has something else they want to add.
So I will say that after being here, I think probably my most significant achievement at Rice was making that diagram of the, I spent like a day making that, the lens, can you? Yeah. So people know what I'm talking about? Like, I can't believe 15 years later, you're still showing my picture. But I'm pretty excited about it.
Anyone else?
The only thing I'll say, the copy editor who's looking at all these biophotos is apparently named Andy Swartz. He's the one that sent the email to us talking about that. So, Ahmed, I'd like to ask if you can dig up a picture of Mr. Swartz. I would like to submit that for my next biophoto.
If not?
Okay, thank you.
So I'm Tom Goldstein. I'm here to tell you a little bit about what happened in the 2010s. It was a great decade. So I want to, it still is a great decade. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got here. How do we arrive at the beginning of the 2010s? Well, back in the 1960s, the fast Fourier transform was the dominant algorithm. And then in the 1980s, the bootstrap just annihilated it. It became, just replaced everything we were doing with the FFT. And then in the 1990s, wavelets came along, and then in the 2000s, compressed sensing. And then we ended up at the beginning of 2010, and then what did we really have to do in the year 2010? The commercial success of compressed sensing had made it almost an irrelevant academic problem. All of our devices were using compressed sensing. All of our cell phones and our computers and our compression algorithms and everything was using compressed sensing. So what was there left for academics to do? So here's just an interesting Google Trends plot to show you what was happening around this time. So you'll see that around there's a little there's a little blip here at 2010. That yellow bump is the peak of compressed sensing and the height of its commercial success. You can see its popularity had basically annihilated, the FFT. And then ultimately what saved us is this, gigantic storm that was on the horizon of deep learning. So I made a timeline. These are major ECE events that took place in this decade. So in 2010, we had the iPad 1. I actually still have an iPad 1. I just replaced it last week. But it was a great device, and this was sort of a decade where there was a rise of apps, and instead of making software, everyone was suddenly interested in making apps on mobile devices. Quantum computing was a big trend that's been accelerating, and I think maybe it's still on its way up. So in 2011, we had the D-Wave computer. People would say it was a fake quantum computer, but it generated a huge amount of hype because of all the excitement in quantum computing. And then perhaps the biggest single event in this decade was AlexNet in 2012. I put that one in bold, and that was the real takeoff of deep learning. This is one of my personal favorites, is Google Glass in 2013. This is the greatest hype curve of all time. It went from being nothing to being the coolest thing in the world to being the least cool thing in the world in about 6 weeks. Fortunately, Rich was not duped into buying one of these things. He was duped into buying 2 of these things. He was very, very excited about it. So IoT became a big thing. In 2014, Dropcam was purchased by Nest. So this was a big IoT event, and was also a big Rice event, because Dropcam was a Rice-affiliated company. Let's see, in 2015, we had hoverboards, which was a very popular thing. And maybe hoverboards themselves weren't that significant, but I think it was a mark in the history of a broader trend toward lithium battery-powered vehicles. And around then, we had the announcement of the Tesla Model 3, and now we have scooters, and all of these things will probably continue. Fake news in 2016, and fake news, I think really changed the way that we think about the internet and the kind of research problems that people are solving with internet data. There was the blockchain explosion in 2018. And then drones is sort of like a building trend throughout the decade. But just last week, there was this announcement, Google Wing. So Google is now going to try to have their own parcel delivery service. So there's a timeline of the 2010s. We also decided to make a timeline of Rich B's clothing choices from 1990 to 2019. So this is what we had in 1990. We had something kind of like this. And then moving forward, we have the rest of the timeline. Yeah. You might want to. Yeah. All right. So, what was hot at Rice in 2010? What were people working on? So this is just an array of things. Of course, we have matrix completion, dictionary learning. Compressive sensing, approximate message passing. There were a bunch of different topics that were really popular at the time. SPARFA was a really big deal. We had SPARFA everything. There were many, many SPARFA papers. We had SPARFA merch. You could buy a SPARFA hat. You could buy anything SPARFA. So what was Rich B doing during that time? Well, most notably, he was doing the Wavelet. It was a holdover. What else was Rich B doing at the time? We were also doing a lot of MOOCs.
Maybe I can filter that out. Have you ever wondered how radar and sonar systems allow us to see invisible targets that are...
Yeah, all right, that's enough. Enough with that. Yeah, so MOOCs was really big. And we were, Rich B's group was really focused on making MOOCs. All right, so the 2010 graveyard. What are some things that ended in the 2010s? Some of these are a little bit debatable, but I want to take a moment to honor the research fields that are no longer with us. Dictionary learning, that was a big thing. I don't know, it's been kind of a downfall on that. Matrix completion was really huge at the beginning of the decade. Phase retrieval, I still work on phase retrieval a little bit. It's kind of embarrassing, but yeah. Moore's Law, this one's debatable, and makes us ECE people very sad. MOOCs, possibly on there. Climate science, for various reasons. The word big data. And this one makes me extra sad. Math. We used to think that the solution to our problems was to think about them deeply, and now you just kind of dump your data into a neural network, and it comes out the other end of a meat grinder, and the computer does all of your thinking for you. We also lost David Bowie. I thought that was worth putting on here. And then there's some things that maybe we should have lost, but we didn't. So compressed sensing is still crawling along. It just won't die. So looking forward into the next decade, we made some predictions for the future. So we have to, you don't know what's on the horizon politically. We could have Trump 2020. We'll probably have some sort of terahertz communication devices. We'll have real reality because of the, we're kind of on the downward side of the virtual reality hype curve. Battery-powered rockets. We haven't figured out how that's going to work yet. Quantum computers, still on the rise. CRISPR babies. This one's interesting because it seems to involve a lot of rice technology, if you're not aware of that. And also edge UAVs for deep quantum blockchains. This is the title of my upcoming ICAST paper. And we had a debate about whether self-driving cars are going to be a big thing. We don't know if autonomous vehicles are ready for people, but with AI and autonomous vehicles and all of this stuff, I think we're likely to see the rise of other autonomous vehicles like delivery bots. It's something that we're looking forward to in the future. And then finally, I just want to say thanks to everybody that was part of the Rice team at that time. I had a great time at Rice when I was here, both personally and professionally, and it was because of all the terrific people. And so regardless of what decade you affiliate yourself with, thank you very much for being part of an amazing community. Thanks.
So thanks to everybody for keeping on such good time this morning. Very impressive. And we'll see everybody at 1:30.